Okay, here we go. This is the end of the camera season, right? Here we go. Let me put my little clip-on microphone on. It's the end of the camera season, and invariably what always happens, which in the camera season is basically after Photokina, because now everybody knows what everybody else is going to be coming out with for the next 5 or 6 plus months. And then the question arises about current cameras relational to older awesome cameras. The one question I've been asked a tremendous amount recently is about the Nikon D500. Here we go. Where does it stand relative to everything else? And here we have the Nikon D850, certainly so the single best do-it-all DSLR ever made, period. It's been out of stock for a dinosaur's age. It's always out of stock everywhere, all the time. People have been complaining about that endlessly. Obviously the sales of it are hot and heavy. Nikon can't make them fast enough. Here we have the Nikon D3S, and Nikon D4. For the sake of discussing legendary cameras, the Nikon D4 and D4S are the same. The performance differences are not that drastic. Same is true with the Nikon D3, D3S, however that's different relative to the D4, D4S. D3S camera performance is radically different than the D3. It's also the reason why working sports and photojournalist photographers are still using the Nikon D3S. Is because they don't need high megapixels, and also too the buffer is incredible on the D3S. When I use the word legendary, I use that word more carefully than anything else I state in a review regarding a camera. For the sake of discussing legendary cameras, there's no difference between the D4, D4S, or the D3 and the D3S. D3X is a bit of a problem, however. That's where Nikon tried to push it too far. They tried to come out with a slightly more improved, well actually, more than slightly, better iteration of the Nikon D3S, and they went too far. That's a matter for another video. But the same is true as the Nikon the Fujifilm X-T2 and the Fujifilm X-T3. Even though the two cameras are separated by substantial performance differences, I said that the X-T2 Fujifilm, for example, is a legendary camera, and it is, and the X-T3 is nothing more than an X-T2 on steroids. So that legacy continues between the X-T2 and X-T3. Where the Nikon D500 falls relative to everything that's already been announced is still absolutely the, how's the best way to put this? It's still the crotch-melting perfection for photojournalism, sports action, and wildlife that it ever was. Now, the D500 only has one issue, and that it is quick to blow out specular highlights. The D500... kind of like I used to have a pet sugar glider, and they're nocturnal animals, and they have gigantic bulging eyes, and anytime you bring that animal out into the bright light, it would squeal. It was basically cussing me in its own little language. D500 is kind of like a nocturnal animal. It is quick to blow out the highlights. It's just a hair too quick, about 2/3 of a stop, too quick to blow out the highlights. As long as you take that into consideration, not a problem. Other people discuss that. I've used the camera that's filming me right now is a D500. I fixed the D500 about 1.5 years ago. Guy sent it to me. It fell down into the creek and it got wet. D500 is incredible. The buffer depth, the autofocus performance. You slap a 200 to 500 Nikkor on the D500. It is a wildlife and bird photographer's wet dream camera. It still is. You know what the Nikon D500 has that the Fujifilm X-T2, X-T3, X-H1 don't have? It's called hardcore glass. We should call it like triple X glass. You know, the really hardcore stuff that you couldn't see when you were... Yeah, the buffer and the hardcore glass. The D500 is as incredible now as it ever was. Has the D850 surpassed it? Yes and no. We can actually call this like a miniature medium format. Actually, interestingly enough, the lossless 14-bit compressed RAW files from the Nikon D850 are exactly the same size as those from my Fujifilm medium format GFX, exactly the same size. It will absolutely take a dump on your XQD and SD cards. Been out shooting on quite a few wildlife and action outings, and my God, 4 sets of cards at 64 gigs was still hardly enough. I mean, it will really chew up the cards fast, especially when you stick the camera in continuous high. Still does not have the buffer depth of the Nikon D500, nor does it have the frame rate of the Nikon D500. So the D500 is still a superior wildlife sports action camera to that of the Nikon D850. Basically, everybody that owns a Nikon D500 and a Nikon D850 will tell you the exact same thing, including Steve Perry and others. Don't like me? Fine. The others have said the same thing that I said, and I said it first. Nikon D850 is not the same as that of the Nikon D500. And of course Nikon probably did that, but the file sizes are huge, so that's understandable. But I was about to say that Nikon probably did that to protect the sales of the Nikon D500. Also too, the D850 at 45 megapixels, if you stick it in crop mode, it's a 20 megapixel camera, the same as the Nikon D500. The pixel pitch is essentially 100% identical. It is, however, a BSI sensor. The D850 I also called a legendary camera. D500 fault, clipping highlights. D850 fault, if it had the buffer depth, which really couldn't have because the file sizes are so huge. They are medium format file sizes, but if it had the buffer depth and the frame rate of the Nikon D500, it would be, it's already the #1 DSLR ever made for anybody as far as the best for everything, period. The single best, do it all, master, jack of all trades and master of all trades DSLR camera. However, it's $3,300. Is it worth $3,300? Actually, yes, it damn well is. Favorite camera, and I've got 2 of them. Where's my D4 at? Here we go. A Nikon D4. This camera is amazing in several regards. The output on it is exactly, everybody, I highly recommended for years and still do, the Nikon D700, even though that camera is getting rather long in the tooth. The color science and the output on that camera is incredible. The only other Nikon that actually has that kind of output, and that uses a Renaissance sensor, which is now owned by Sony, but at the time it was not owned by Sony, is a Renaissance sensor. The 16 megapixel giant pixel pitch on this camera is almost impossible, not literally, but it is nearly impossible to clip the highlights on a Nikon D4, D4S. Pixel pitch, a well saturation, takes quite a lot. In other words, you really got to do something stupid, some stupid time to actually clip the highlights on a Nikon D4. Incredible camera. The D4 still sells average $1,800 with less than 100,000 clicks on it. Most of them are ragged out and they're pretty ugly, but they still go strong and they still sell for hot money because the D4 is effing incredible. The Nikon D3 and Nikon D4 are the toughest digital cameras ever made. Build quality wise, that's not my opinion, that's a hardcore damn fact, period, shut the hell up, hardcore fact. Nikon D300 has come down quite a lot recently. The autofocus is not that fast, low light performance not so great. You got plenty of light or you got a speed light and you don't need to crop your shot very much. The Nikon D3 is incredible. So too is the D3S. All 4 of these cameras and its 2 familiars, the D3, D3S, D4, D4S, all of those cameras are legendary. That's the highest possible acclamation I could give to any camera. These cameras they beat the hell out of anything Canon has, even in dynamic range alone, which is quite important. Build quality for sure. They all can drive screw drive lenses. You can now the peaking, I mean, it's not a mirrorless camera. I mean, DSLR has advantages and mirrorless has advantages. Undeniably so. The D850 is a huge improvement on that. You do have live view peaking, and it is easier to autofocus fine-tune the lenses on the D850 as opposed to these older model cameras, including the D500. But the D500 is as incredible now as it ever was. Now that Photokina has closed out and the year 2018 is closing out, where the hell do these cameras fall? They fall in the same places they ever did. Legendary is it's kind of like those 80, they're not 80 years old, those 60-year-old post office leather bags that I've got, which I don't have one out here right now. You know, it's like classic perfection. It's kind of like an old car, you know, it doesn't go very fast. You know, I can't think of a really awesome classic car, maybe a 54 Chevy or something like that. Slow, heavy, you know, it doesn't have a lot of safety features like airbags and You know, it's maybe the transmission drips a little. The car is a highly desirable perfection of classic. Now, it's kind of hard to say that about electronics, isn't it? It is and it isn't, but there's still plenty of parts out there for D3, D4 cameras, tons of parts, and they will be for quite a long time. The shutter mech is going to fail on these. To replace the shutter mech on any four of these cameras averages about $600. Same thing with the shutter mech on a mirrorless camera, which does have a shutter mech with a first curtain and a second curtain on it. These cameras are as incredible now as they ever were. Do you kind of look with a slanted or cocked eye at the D3, D3X, or D4 for sports action autofocus acquisition and tracking? You do a little bit because we're spoiled now. We're all spoiled children. And that's understandable. But these cameras still command a lot of money because they are hardcore, hard-ass workhorses of true photographic tool perfection. Obviously, it's your skill to bring that magic out. They're nothing more than tools, obviously so, but they are the epitome of pinnacle versions of what they are made to represent as the interface between, you know, the creative photographer, the working photographer, and the ability to get the shot. D850, single best do-it-all DSLR ever made. It's not changed. D500, the wet dream lens for sports action wildlife. The buffer, amazing. Oh my God, it's amazing. It's got one fault, you know, clipping highlights. All of these cameras have one minor fault. They're all legendary, however. They are absolutely unbelievable. I would never, in a million years, I have two of these cameras. It's like, what do you need two of them for? I would never, ever part with my... Did I leave the battery in this one the last time I used it? No, I didn't. I would never, ever part with either one of my Nikon D4s. I just would not. These cameras are unbelievable. I love the dynamic range on the Nikon D4. It's just amazing. Full frame, a 16 megapixel, gigantic eyeballs, dynamic range that will just melt your friggin' crotch. It's just like you take an awesome Nikon lens and you slap it on a Nikon D4 and use like a speed light and you take a headshot or whew, shit. Like holy shit. Define perfection. Well, here's perfection. 105 f2 DC Nikon with a studio strobe mounted on and that lens mounted on the Nikon D4. Oh my God. There's nothing out there that's made currently that will compete with that. You could even Photoshop the hell out of it. You could bring it to that level, but that's what the Nikon D4 or D4S will actually drop straight out of camera before you do any editing. Obviously, you don't have a lot of room for cropping at 16 megapixels. Yeah? So if you want to take pictures of the speckle-breasted woodpecker with a 600mm lens and he's like 800 yards that way, you know, yeah, you need that extreme croppability by mounting a 600mm 5.6 or 800mm on a Nikon D850 or D500. Crop the hell out of the shot. You know, it's the right tool for the right job. So I had a lot of people recently ask us, well, and all the cameras have been announced, what about the Nikon D500? Where does it still fall? Well, it still falls the same place it ever did. So, because when I say a camera is legendary, I make that statement very, very, very carefully. Because if I call something legendary and it falls short of that, oh boy, they'll crucify me. As well they should. These cameras are all, and the XT2, XT3 is also legendary. That's actually the only mirrorless camera that I call legendary. Not because I hate mirrorless or anything, it's just because it's the only mirrorless camera that I've ever used that I can actually call legendary. And it is. XT2, XT3, D4, D4S, D3, D3S, same thing. Just, so that's my video. I hope you liked it. If you do, you could always click the link below and drop me a buck or two because I have no affiliate links. I'm not pimping and shilling like everybody else got Amazon links and you know, BH Photo and Adorama hot links out the wazoo. I don't have any of that. Never have, never will. I don't sell anything. I just want you to be happy and, you know, make the best purchase with your money. And this is the kind of video people always ask me for at the end of the year because they're thinking about buying a Christmas gift either from themselves or their photography buddy or a significant other or whatnot. Usually that's what people do at the end of the year. It's like, I've been saving up for the so-and-so and, you know, I want to buy myself a gift for the holidays. Because that happens every year. Thank you. Either that or the blooming photography child. Your little daughter or your little son, something like that. Man, I tell you what. When I was younger, of course, when the D4 came out, I wasn't that young. Man, if I were young today and I was like into photography and someone gave me like a used, if I know what I know, someone gave me a, well, kids these days are spoiled brats. They may not. But God, no, I would be like, oh my God, it'd be a perfect Christmas gift. Are you kidding me? A Nikon D4 for Christmas? You do everything with this camera. You know, this camera was $6,500 when it came out. It's still a $6,500 camera. It's just not, doesn't sell for that. You see that distinction there? It's still a $6,500 camera. It just doesn't sell for that. It's the same thing when you buy like a 20-year-old Lamborghini or Maserati or something. It doesn't cost that anymore, but that's exactly what it is. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you like these videos. Peace out, Girl Scout.